Good evening. The man who murdered 3 people from Wilshire, Ohio, has his execution date now set.
Christy and Michelle were 14 and 17, respectively. On the way back to Wilshire, Ohio, the 3 disappeared. They were found stripped from the waist down in Tampa Bay, bound and tied to concrete blocks. Oba Chandler. Chandler was convicted in 1994. He recently told his lawyer he's tired of being on death row.
After spending 17 long years on death row, Oba Chandler had finally reached his last minutes on Earth. It was November 15, 2011, and inside the Florida State Prison, the man once feared for his cold, calculated crimes sat in silence. His execution was scheduled for 4:08 p.m., marking the final chapter of a story that began with terror on the waters of Tampa Bay. This would be his last day, his last meal, his last breath. Before facing the needle, Chandler was served his final meal. 2 salami sandwiches on white bread with mustard, a peanut butter and grape jelly sandwich, iced tea and coffee. It was simple, almost childlike. The kind of meal you'd never expect from a man capable of unimaginable cruelty. He had no final words, no apology, no reflection, just a blank stare, as if the weight of what he'd done never touched him. At exactly 4:25 p.m., the lethal drugs began to flow through his veins. Within minutes, the man who had haunted Florida's coast was gone, declared dead at 4:25 p.m., aged 65. At the time of his death, Chandler was suffering from coronary artery disease, high blood pressure, and failing kidneys. But his crimes had left deeper scars than his own failing body ever could. To understand why the state of Florida decided to end his life, we have to go back to a summer evening in June 1989, when the calm waters of Tampa Bay carried a nightmare to the surface. 3 bodies, a mother and her 2 teenage daughters, were found floating, their hands and feet bound, their necks tied to concrete blocks, and the chilling truth that they had been thrown into the bay while still alive. What began as a family vacation ended in horror, and the man responsible would hide in plain sight for years, smiling at neighbors, running his business, and pretending to be just another hard-working father. But behind that smile was a monster, and this is the story of how Oba Chandler's own evil led him straight to the execution chamber. It was May 26, 1989, when Joan "Joe" Rogers packed up her car in Wilshire, Ohio. She was 36 years old, a hard-working farmer's wife who rarely took a break from life on their family dairy farm. This trip was special. She was taking her 2 daughters, 17-year-old Michelle and 14-year-old Christy, on their first real vacation outside Ohio. They were heading to Florida, the land of beaches, sunshine, and freedom. They left early that morning, the girls excited and smiling. For days, they visited Orlando's theme parks, saw the attractions and took pictures with their small Kodak camera. It was supposed to be a memory they'd cherish forever. But none of them knew this trip would be their last. By June 1st, 1989, they began their drive back home. It was a warm Florida afternoon when they left Orlando around 9 a.m. The plan was simple: stop for a night, rest, and continue driving back to Ohio the next morning. But somewhere along Route 60, Joan got lost. She wasn't used to city roads, and Tampa Bay's winding bridges could confuse anyone who wasn't from there. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the Rogers women met a man, tall, middle-aged, confident. His name was Oba Chandler. He told them he could help. He was friendly, polite, and even mentioned that he was originally from Ohio, too. That small detail made Joan relax. It made her trust him. Chandler gave them directions to a day's inn along Route 60 near the Courtney Campbell Causeway, a long bridge stretching across the calm blue waters of Tampa Bay. He even wrote down directions on a small piece of paper, his neat handwriting looping smoothly. He told them he could take them on a sunset boat ride later that evening. At 12:30 p.m., Joan and her daughters checked into the day's inn. The room was simple: 2 beds, a small balcony, and a view of the bay. Photos found later from a roll of film in their camera showed Michelle sitting on the floor smiling, and another photo, the last one, showed the sun slowly sinking over the water. The sky glowed orange and pink, the kind of beauty that makes you forget everything else. That picture would be the last image they ever took. At around 7:30 that night, Hotel staff saw the three women eating dinner at the hotel restaurant. They were calm, happy, unaware of what was coming. Around 8:30 to 9 p.m, it's believed they met Chandler again at the dock near the causeway, just as he promised. Witnesses later said they saw a small blue and white boat leaving the area around that time. By 3 a.m, they were dead. 3 days later, on June 4, 1989, the first body was spotted floating in Tampa Bay. It was around 7 in the morning. A group of sailors crossing under the Sunshine Skyway Bridge thought they saw a log drifting by, but as they got closer they froze. It wasn't a log. It was a body, face down in the water. Minutes later, the Coast Guard received another call. Another body, this time near a pier in St. Petersburg, about 2 miles north. And then a third call. 3 bodies in total, all female, all floating face down. The sight was horrifying. Each woman had her hands and feet tied. A thick rope was wrapped around her neck, connected to a heavy concrete block, meant to drag her to the bottom. They were naked below the waist, a detail that revealed the dark truth investigators feared most. The medical examiners confirmed their worst suspicions. All 3 victims had water in their lungs, meaning they were still alive when they hit the water. Michelle, the older daughter, had somehow managed to free one of her hands before she drowned. It was a sign she fought until her last breath. The Florida sun was blazing that morning as officers worked to recover the bodies. Boats surrounded the area, news reporters gathered on the pier, and police covered the shoreline with yellow tape. It was a scene that would haunt every detective there for years to come. The victims were soon identified as Joan Rogers and her daughters, Michelle and Christ, a small-town family from Ohio who had simply come for a vacation. The case shocked everyone. How could anyone do something so cruel to a mother and her teenage girls? Detectives searched their hotel room and found everything neatly in place: luggage, clothes, camera, and the car parked just outside. But on the dashboard they found one piece of paper. It looked ordinary at first, just directions, neatly written in blue ink. But those words, and that handwriting, would eventually solve one of Florida's most chilling murder mysteries. It was the beginning of a hunt that would last 3 long years, a hunt that would lead straight back to one man, the same man who smiled kindly at a lost mother and her daughters, then took them for a ride they would never return from. For a full week, the 3 bodies found floating in Tampa Bay remained nameless. The Florida heat had caused them to decompose quickly, making identification difficult. The water had washed away their features, leaving investigators with almost no clues about who they were or how they ended up there. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away in Wilshire, Ohio, a quiet farmhouse sat eerily still. Inside, Hal Rogers, husband to Joan and father to Michelle and Krista, was pacing the floor, his heart heavy with worry. His wife and daughters were supposed to be home days ago. At first, he thought maybe they'd taken a detour or had car trouble. But when no one answered the phone and days turned into a week, he knew something was terribly wrong. Hal finally called the police in Ohio and reported them missing. Soon, word began to spread. 3 female bodies had been found in Florida. But it would take several more days before anyone could confirm the horrifying truth. On June 8th, a housekeeper at the Days Inn in Tampa reported that one of the rooms hadn't been touched in over a week. The beds were neatly made, the luggage still in place, and the towels folded just as they had been when the family checked in. Nothing was missing, not even the camera on the nightstand. The hotel manager contacted the police immediately. Detectives arrived at the scene and began dusting for fingerprints. Within hours, they matched the prints to the unidentified bodies pulled from Tampa Bay. Final confirmation came through dental records, and with that, the nightmare became real. The 3 women were identified as Joan Rogers and her 2 daughters, Michelle and Krista. When the news reached Hal, his world fell apart. Friends said he dropped the phone and collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. The community in Wilshire was stunned. A small, close-knit town where everyone knew everyone, now mourning 3 of their own. Back in Florida, detectives worked around the clock to figure out what had happened. Marine researchers at the University of South Florida helped map out the water currents. They concluded that the women were thrown into the bay from a boat, not from a bridge or the shore. The killer had been out on the water with them. Soon after, investigators found the Rogers family car, a 1984 Oldsmobile Calais with Ohio plates, parked near the Courtney Campbell Causeway. The doors were locked and nothing inside seemed stolen. But on the dashboard was something strange, a folded map with handwritten directions in neat cursive. Those words would soon become the most important clue in the entire case. For more than 3 years, the case remained unsolved. Detectives were flooded with leads. Hundreds of phone calls, thousands of tips, and even a few false confessions. Then a break finally came from an unexpected place. A police bulletin from Madeira Beach described a recent assault on a 24-year-old Canadian tourist. The woman said she'd been taken on a boat ride by a man who later tried to attack her, but she escaped. The description of the man, his voice, and even his boat all matched details from the Rogers case. That man was Oba Chandler. Detectives dug deeper. The handwriting on the map from the Rogers car was compared to samples Chandler had written on a work order. The letters matched perfectly. To confirm it, police did something unusual. They put billboards all over Tampa Bay showing a blown-up photo of the suspect's handwriting, asking the public if anyone recognized it. Days later, a call came in from one of Chandler's former neighbors. She said, "I know that handwriting. That's Oba's." From there, everything fell into place. Handwriting experts confirmed the match. A palm print found on the brochure matched Chandler's too. Detectives also discovered that right after the billboards went up, Chandler had sold his boat and quickly moved away with his family to Port Orange, near Daytona Beach. Running from the past he knew was catching up to him. On September 24, 1992, Oba Chandler was arrested and charged with the murders of Joan, Michelle, and Krista Rogers. At first, police believed there might have been a second man involved, maybe someone who helped him lure or control the victims. This idea even appeared in a 1991 episode of Unsolved Mysteries. But after Chandler's arrest, investigators realized he had done everything alone. The theory fell apart when they learned Chandler had a habit of approaching women by himself, using his smooth talk and fake friendliness to gain trust. Investigators also looked into other possible suspects, including Joan Rogers, Hal's brother. John was already serving time in prison for rape and was accused of sexually assaulting Michelle before the murders. For a time, police wondered if he could have arranged their deaths from behind bars, but there was no evidence. Eventually, he was cleared. Even Hal Rogers himself became a temporary suspect when police found out he had withdrawn $7,000 around the time his family disappeared. But Hal explained he had taken the money to fund his own search for them. Records later proved he never left Ohio. The deeper detectives looked, the clearer it became. The friendly man from the Causeway, the one who had written those directions on the map and promised a sunset cruise, was the same man who tied their hands, threw them overboard, and watched them die. The hunt for truth was finally over. The monster had a name: Oba Chandler. Before he became known as one of Florida's most hated killers, Oba Chandler was just another face in the crowd, quiet, ordinary, almost forgettable. But behind that calm look was a life filled with pain, violence, and broken choices that shaped the monster he later became. Chandler was born on October 11, 1946, in Cincinnati, Ohio. He was the fourth of 5 children in a poor working-class family. His father, Oba Chandler Sr., and his mother, Margaret Johnson, struggled to provide for their children. The home was small and tense, filled with shouting, poverty, and sadness. Then, when Oba was just 10 years old, tragedy struck. In June 1957, his father hanged himself in the basement of their apartment. The sight of it would scar Oba forever. At the funeral, as dirt began to fall over the coffin, young Oba suddenly jumped into his father's grave, crying uncontrollably. That image stayed with everyone who saw it, a small boy lost between grief and confusion. But instead of healing, Oba grew cold. By age 14, he had already turned to crime. He began stealing cars and breaking into homes around Cincinnati. Between 14 and 18, he was arrested more than 20 times. Prison became familiar, not as punishment, but as part of life. As an adult, Chandler didn't stop. He was charged with a long list of crimes: burglary, loitering, armed robbery, kidnapping, and even possessing counterfeit money. His record read like a warning of what was coming. People who knew him said he could be charming, polite when he wanted to be, the kind of man who could make you trust him in minutes. But underneath there was something off. Women described him as creepy, always watching, always too confident. In one disturbing case, he was caught masturbating while peeping through a woman's window. In another, far worse, Chandler and an accomplice broke into a couple's home at gunpoint. He made the man tie himself with speaker wire, then dragged the woman into the bedroom, forced her to strip to her underwear, and rubbed the cold barrel of his gun across her stomach. He didn't just rob his victims, he humiliated them. Despite all this, Chandler managed to slip through the cracks of the system. He would serve short sentences, get out, and go right back to his old ways. By the late 1980s, he had moved to Florida, working as an unlicensed aluminum siding contractor. To neighbors, he was a quiet family man who lived with his wife and children. To others, he was just a smooth-talking drifter who always seemed to have money but no real job. What most people didn't know was that between May and September of 1991, while the triple murder case was still open, Chandler was actually working as an informant for the U.S. Customs Bureau in Tampa. The same man helping law enforcement was secretly the suspect they were hunting. When detectives finally arrested him in 1992 for the murders of Joan, Michelle, and Krista Rogers, Chandler acted calm. Against the advice of his lawyers, he chose to testify in his own defense, claiming innocence. He admitted that he met the women and gave them directions, but swore he never saw them again. His story didn't convince anyone. The evidence, his handwriting, his palm print, the map, told the truth he wouldn't. After 3 years of investigation and one of Florida's most publicized manhunts, the man responsible for the murders of Joan Rogers and her 2 daughters finally stood trial. Oba Chandler faced justice in Clearwater, Florida, a courtroom packed with reporters, detectives, and a community still haunted by the horror of what he had done. Chandler took the stand in his own defense, claiming he was innocent. He admitted meeting the Rogers family and giving them directions, but insisted he never saw them again, except on the billboards and newspaper headlines that carried his own handwriting. He admitted he was out on Tampa Bay the night of the murders, but said he was fishing alone. His story was riddled with inconsistencies. Chandler told jurors that his boat engine had failed due to a fuel line leak, forcing him to stay on the water longer than expected. He claimed he had called the Coast Guard for help, but investigators found no such record. Boat mechanics later testified that Chandler's explanation made no sense. The fuel lines on his boat ran upward, meaning a leak would have sprayed gasoline into the air, dissolving any duct tape he claimed to have used. Then came the witnesses. A woman named Judy Blair testified that just 2 weeks before the murders, Chandler had invited her on a boat trip, raped her, and left her traumatized. Her detailed account of that night bore eerie similarities to the Rogers case, same approach, same method, same waters. It painted a chilling picture of a man who had done this before. A former employee also took the stand, saying Chandler once bragged about spending a night on the bay with 3 women. The same night Joan Rogers and her daughters vanished. Phone records proved Chandler made several ship-to-shore calls from his boat between 1 and 5 a.m., right around the time of the murders. Prosecutors argued these calls were part of his alibi, a desperate attempt to make it seem like he was home. But the most haunting testimony came from Chandler's own daughter, Crystal. She told the jury that her father once admitted to killing 3 women and said he was terrified to return to Tampa. Another witness, a hotel maid, testified she saw Chandler near the Rogers room the night they disappeared. By November 4, 1994, the evidence was overwhelming. The jury found Oba Chandler guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. Judge Susan Schaefer called him a man with no soul before sentencing him to death. The courtroom was silent, except for the sobs of family members who had waited years for justice. Chandler never showed remorse. He continued to appeal his conviction, maintaining his innocence until the end. His wife, Deborah, divorced him shortly after the trial, taking their daughter and cutting all contact. Even in prison, Chandler remained cold and distant. He never had a single visitor during his 17 years on death row. Judge Schaefer would later reflect, "It was the worst case I ever handled. There was no saving grace in him at all." After 17 years on death row, Oba Chandler's time was running out. On October 10, 2011, Florida Governor Rick Scott signed his death warrant, sealing his fate. The execution was scheduled for November 15, 2011 at exactly 4 p.m. at Florida State Prison. In Rayford. For Chandler, the countdown had begun. His lawyer, Bayer Harrison, said Chandler wasn't fighting anymore. "He's not putting a lot of pressure on me to find some magic way out," Harrison told reporters. "He's not going to make a scene. He just wants me to do what I reasonably can." By then, Chandler was in poor health, battling high blood pressure, heart disease, kidney problems, and arthritis. Decades behind bars had taken a toll on his body, but not on his defiance. In the weeks leading up to his death, Harrison tried one last time to halt the execution, arguing that Florida's death penalty system was unconstitutional because judges, not juries, made the final sentencing decision. A hearing was held on October 21st, but Chandler refused to attend. He hated the trip to Clearwater, Harrison explained, saying his client didn't like the ride and wasn't well. The motion was quickly denied. Every remaining appeal to the Florida Supreme Court and even the U.S. Supreme Court was rejected. By November 15th, all legal doors were closed. At 4:08 p.m., Oba Chandler was strapped to the gurney. Witnesses watched from behind glass as the lethal injection began. He declined to make a final spoken statement, but handed prison officials a short note that read, "You are killing an innocent man today." Governor Rick Scott later said his decision was straightforward. "He killed 3 women," the governor explained. "I looked through different cases. It made sense to do that one. It was the right case." Not everyone agreed. Chandler's daughter, Valerie Troxell, maintained her father's innocence, saying, "I don't think he alone could have done it. The palm print only proved he met them, not that he killed them." She even wrote to Governor Scott pleading for clemency, but her request went unanswered. Chandler's son, Jeff, also believed his father was a victim of media bias. "He was convicted long before the trial," he said. "The media can destroy you." But others felt no sympathy. Another of Chandler's daughters, Suzette, publicly called him a monster who got what he deserved. To her, justice had finally been served. Got it. "I rewrote the execution scene to be clear, cinematic, and step-by-step, and I included his last meal, final written note, and health issues. It's in simple English and about 3,000 characters long. The final hours and the last meal." In the morning, Chandler was offered a last meal. He chose simple sandwiches. 2 salami sandwiches on white bread with mustard, a peanut butter and grape jelly sandwich on white bread, iced tea, and a cup of coffee. He ate slowly, more out of habit than hunger. There were no visitors that day. In fact, he had not received a single visitor during his 17 years on death row. All legal appeals were exhausted. Prison officials completed their final checks. The death warrant was verified, witness lists were confirmed, and medical staff declared him transportable. His attorney, Bayer Harrison, was present, but there were no last-minute stays or motions. At the appointed hour, guards escorted Chandler from his cell. He was walked down long, echoing corridors. Each step was deliberate. Every door they passed was locked and sealed. The walk itself is meant to be controlled, to prevent panic and to allow the inmate a final moment of time. Before entering the chamber, he sat briefly in a holding area where officials confirmed identity, read the death warrant aloud, and asked whether he had any last spoken words. Chandler declined to speak. A short written statement he left with officials was later read, "You are killing an innocent man today." He was moved into the execution chamber and placed on the padded gurney. Medical staff attached IV lines to his arms. Guards fastened restraints across his chest, arms, and legs. Standard procedure to keep the inmate still and to ensure the drugs are delivered safely. The room is small and clinical. A thick glass wall separates the condemned from the witnesses. Selected witnesses, family members of the victims, prison officials, and members of the press, sat on the other side of the glass. A priest or spiritual advisor is usually allowed. In this case, no public last spiritual statement was announced. The warden read final official statements, verified the time, and confirmed protocol steps. The execution team administered the lethal injection. Protocols vary, but the process is deliberate. Medical personnel push the drugs through the IV in a set order. The flow of chemicals is meant to cause unconsciousness, respiratory arrest, and then cardiac arrest. Because of Chandler's known heart and kidney problems, medical staff monitored him closely for visible reaction. Within minutes, Chandler became still. A physician or designated medical official checked for vital signs. At 4:08 p.m., the official pronouncement was made. Oba Chandler was dead. The warden read the time of death. The brief written message Chandler left was then disclosed to the press. "You are killing an innocent man today." He had no final spoken words. Prison staff removed Chandler's body and followed legal procedures for handling the remains. The family of the victims and officials processed the closure of a case that had spanned decades. For some, his death was the end of a long quest for justice. For others, including some of Chandler's children, questions remained. For many, the story of Oba Chandler was supposed to end on November 15, 2011, the moment he was declared dead by lethal injection. But 3 years later, in February 2014, investigators uncovered a disturbing truth that proved Chandler's evil reached further than anyone had imagined. Using new DNA technology, authorities confirmed that Chandler was responsible for another unsolved murder, that of 20-year-old Ivelisse Berrios Begueris, a newlywed from Coral Springs, Florida. On November 27, 1990, Ivelisse was last seen leaving her job at the Sawgrass Mills Mall, where she worked at a sporting goods store. When she didn't return home, her husband drove to the mall and found her car, a 1985 Ford Tempo, sitting in the parking lot with all 4 tires slashed. Investigators believe Chandler had been stalking her for days. He slashed her tires, then approached pretending to be a helpful stranger. Ivelisse likely accepted his offer, unaware she had just stepped into the hands of a predator. Just 3 hours after she was reported missing, 2 fishermen returning home discovered her nude body under a neighborhood mailbox. Her wrists and ankles were bound, her hair matted with brown tape, and the autopsy revealed she had been raped and strangled. The case had gone cold for decades, until Chandler's DNA was matched to the evidence in 2014, finally bringing closure to her family. Police officially declared the case solved and began investigating other unsolved crimes in areas where Chandler had lived or worked, fearing he may have claimed more unknown victims. The Oba Chandler story has been told in countless documentaries and books. It inspired a Pulitzer Prize-winning newspaper series titled Angels Demons by Thomas French, and episodes of Unsolved Mysteries, Forensic Files, Cold Case Files, and On the Case with Paula Zahn. Each retelling revisited the horror of the Rogers family murders and the hidden life of a man who looked ordinary but carried darkness beyond comprehension. Even in death, Oba Chandler's shadow continued to stretch, revealing that justice had ended one man, but not the echo of his crimes.